The gunshot was a flat, deafening crack that tore through the mundane Saturday morning air of redemption. Alex Finch, her hand hovering over a bolt of calico in Abernathy's general store, flinched as if struck. A scream followed, thin and sharp, then another, and the world outside the store's dusty windows dissolved into chaos. Men's shouted, horses whinnied in terror, and the rhythmic thud of running boots pounded the boardwalk. Alex's first instinct was for her son. 7-year-old Samuel was just outside, promised a stick of horehound candy for his patients, his small form mesmerized by the blacksmith hammering sparks from a horseshoe. Her heart seized a knot of pure cold dread. She dropped the fabric and bolted for the door, shoving past a panicked Mr. Abernathy, who was fumbling to slide the heavy bar across. "My boy," she cried, her voice swallowed by the rising din. She burst onto the porch, and the scene that met her eyes was a tableau from a fever dream. 4 masked men, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, were orchestrating the robbery of the Dakota Territorial Bank. 2 stood guard in the street, their rifles leveled, forcing townsfolk to the ground. Dust plumed from the dirt street, thick and choking, catching the harsh midday sun in a golden haze of violence. The other 2 were inside the bank. Her frantic eyes scanned the street. There, Samuel. He was crouched behind an overturned water trough, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. He was safe for now. A wave of relief so potent it left her weak washed over her, immediately replaced by the sharp tang of fear. She was pinned down, separated from her son by a field of open ground where bullets might fly at any moment. The bank doors crashed open. One of the robbers emerged, dragging the bank manager, Mr. Hemlock, by his collar. The box, the robber snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp, the one marked with a surveyor's plumb. "Open it now, or I'll open your head." They weren't just grabbing cash from the teller drawers. They were after something specific. Alex pressed herself against the wall of the general store, trying to make herself small. It was then that her gaze fell on the 4th man, on the one guarding the alleyway beside the bank. He was tall and lean, his movements economical and deadly. As he shifted his weight, his boot caught the light, and Alex's breath caught in her throat. On his heel was a silver spur, intricately carved into the shape of a coiled rattlesnake. It was unique, gaudy, unforgettable, and she had heard it described in excruciating detail only once before. Her mind plunged back a year to a cold night just before the sickness took hold. Her husband Thomas had returned from town, his face pale and his jaw set with a quiet fury he rarely showed. He'd been in a dispute over a boundary line with an associate of the cattle baron, Silas Kane. The man was all threats and smiles, Alex Thomas had whispered, his voice heavy with foreboding. He wore these ridiculous silver spurs. Snakes. Said a man has to be a snake to survive in this land. A week later, the coughing began. The doctor called it lung fever, a swift and merciless illness that was common on the prairie. But now, seeing that spur, a doubt cold and terrible crept into her heart. It was a seed of a suspicion so monstrous she had never dared give it light. A shot rang out, snapping her back to the present. A deputy, brave or foolish, had tried to draw his weapon. The man with the silver spur moved with liquid speed, his pistol barking once. The deputy crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The metallic scent of blood and gunpowder filled the air. Alex clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, her eyes locked on Samuel, who had buried his face in his hands. The robbers inside the bank finally got what they wanted. They emerged with a heavy metal lockbox, the kind used for valuable documents. Without another word, they mounted their horses, firing a final volley into the air to cover their escape. They galloped out of town, leaving behind a dead deputy, a ransacked bank, and a silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the town stirred back to life. Alex ran her skirts, kicking up dust. Her entire world narrowed to the small, trembling boy behind the water trough. She knelt and pulled Samuel into her arms, burying her face in his hair, inhaling the scent of sunshine and soap and childhood. He was shaking, his small body rigid with shock. "It's all right, Sammy," she murmured, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's over now. Mama's here." But as she held her son, her eyes were drawn back to the spot where the man with the silver spur had stood. The robbery was no longer a random act of violence. It was a message, a ghost from her husband's past, reaching into her present. The lockbox they stole. Thomas had a box just like it in that very bank. He'd told her it held the deed to their land and some of his old surveying papers, a precaution he'd said in case of a fire at the homestead. Suddenly, the fight for her small patch of land by Whispering Creek wasn't just about water rights or fending off a greedy cattle baron. It was about a silver spur, a lockbox, and a husband whose death no longer felt like a simple tragedy. It felt like a secret someone was willing to kill for. The journey home was a silent ordeal. The creak and groan of the old wagon wheels seemed to count out the beats of Alex's racing heart, each turn a rotation closer to an isolation that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Samuel, exhausted by the terror of the morning, had finally fallen asleep in the wagon bed, his face still pale beneath a smattering of freckles. The landscape offered no comfort. It was an endless expanse of ochre dust, where the heat shimmered like a phantom lake on the horizon, and the sun felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. Thomas had loved this land. He saw life where others saw desolation. He would point out the subtle purple of the prairie clover, the resilience of the cottonwoods lining the creek, the soaring grace of a hawk against a sapphire sky. For Alex today, the land was a reflection of her own burgeoning dread, vast, empty, and ruled by a harsh, indifferent sun. Every shadow seemed to menace, every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of returning riders. The silver spur flashed in her mind's eye, a venomous glint of metal. The casual brutality of the man who wore it, the cold finality of the deputy's fall, these images were burned into her memory. She tried to push down the dark tendrils of suspicion about Thomas's death, telling herself it was grief and fear playing tricks on her mind. But the doubt once planted had taken root. Lung fever had been swift, yes, but hadn't Dr. Adams himself seemed perplexed by its violence? It tore through him like a wildfire. He had said, his brow furrowed. "Faster than any case I've ever seen." When their small sod-roofed cabin finally came into view, nestled in a gentle curve of Whispering Creek, a pang of loneliness, sharp and familiar, pierced through her fear. This was the home they had built, hauling the timber, cutting the sod, their hands chapped and their bodies aching, but their hearts full of a shared dream. Now the silence that greeted her was absolute. That evening, after seeing to the livestock and tucking a still subdued Samuel into his cot, Alex moved through the motions of her solitary life. She set one plate, one cup, and one fork on the small wooden table. The emptiness of the other side of the table was a constant, dull ache. She remembered the way Thomas's laughter used to fill this small room, the way he would tap his fingers on the table while he waited for supper, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. Tonight, the silence didn't just feel empty. It felt watchful. The memory of her husband was no longer a comfort. It was a ghost demanding answers. As the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a storm began to gather in the west. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an unspoken tension that matched the turmoil in her own soul. The wind picked up a low moan that built into a mournful howl, clawing at the cabin walls. Alex sat by the hearth, the shotgun Thomas had taught her to use resting across her lap. She wasn't just afraid of the storm. She was afraid of the night of the dark, of the knock on the door that might come. She felt utterly alone, a tiny point of light in an ocean of encroaching darkness. And then it came. It wasn't a timid rap. It was a heavy, desperate thud, barely audible over the gale, a sound of flesh and bone against wood. Alex froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The shotgun felt slick in her sweating palms. Her mind raced. Rock, Kane's men. The robbers from the bank come to finish a job. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice a thin thread against the storm's roar. A groan was the only answer, a sound of pure agony that seemed to be swallowed by the wind. It was a human sound, a wounded sound. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay barred and hidden, she crept toward the door. Peeking through a small crack in the weathered planks, she saw a shape slumped against the frame. A flash of lightning bleached the landscape white, and the image burned itself into her mind. It was a man, an Indian. His long black hair was matted with mud and what looked like blood. He wore the buckskin leggings and breechcloth of a Lakota warrior, but his body was a wreck. He was unconscious or close to it, and as she watched, he slid down the door, leaving a smear of dark liquid, and collapsed onto the porch with a soft thud. Her blood ran cold. The stories of raids of settlers killed were fresh. The Battle of the Little Bighorn had happened only a few months prior, and the territory was a tinderbox of fear and hatred. Harboring this man would be a death sentence. They would call her a traitor. Silas Kane would have the excuse he needed to burn her out. But then lightning flashed again, illuminating the man's prone form. She saw not just the blood, but the source of it. He had a dark, spreading stain on his thigh, a gunshot wound by the looks of it. And on his arm, a deep, jagged gash, long and clean, as if from a knife in a struggle. He wasn't just a wounded warrior. He was a man who had been in a desperate fight. He stirred his head, lolling to the side. His lips moved, and in a delirious whisper that the wind carried to her ear, he muttered words in a language she didn't understand. Yet two phrases repeated in a feverish chant stood out, their cadence sharp with pain and urgency. Later she would learn they meant silver spur and stolen papers. The words struck her like a physical blow. Silver spur, stolen papers. This man dying on her doorstep was connected to the bank robbery. But how was he one of them? Or was he like her, a victim of their violence? The gash on his arm, the desperate flight that had brought him here. It spoke of a fight of opposition. She looked at Samuel sleeping peacefully, his face a picture of innocence. What kind of world was she raising him in if she let a man, any man, die on her doorstep, when he might hold the key to the truth about his father's death? Thomas, a devout man, despite the harshness of his life, had always said mercy ain't a choice, Alex. It's a debt we owe to God for our own breath. Cursing herself, her fear, and the cruel fate that had sent this trial to her door, she unbarred it. The wind blasted in, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the room into near darkness. With a strength born of desperation, she grabbed the warrior under his arms and dragged his dead weight inside. The scent of rain blood and prairie soil filled her small home. She had just invited the devil or an avenging angel into her house. At that moment, she couldn't tell which was worse. The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a canyon of fear. The Lakota warrior drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. Alex worked tirelessly, her hands clinical and detached, cleaning the horrific bullet wound in his thigh and stitching the gash on his arm. She used pliers sterilized in the fire to probe for the lead ball, her stomach churning at the gruesome task. Finally, she found it a flattened piece of lead she dropped into a tin bowl with a sickening clink. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and willow bark, her grandmother's remedies, and splinted the shattered leg as best she could with 2 pieces of firewood and strips of her own bedsheets. Samuel, initially terrified, slowly grew accustomed to the stranger's presence. He watched his mother's ceaseless compassion, and it became his own, bringing her clean rags and bowls of cool water from the creek. On the 4th day, the fever broke. The warrior's eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, and filled with a raw, caged hostility. He tried to sit up, a guttural cry of pain escaping his lips. "Easy," Alex said softly, holding up her hands. "You're safe here." He didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for deceit. For 2 days, a charged silence filled the cabin. He refused to let her near him, only eating the food she left when she was on the other side of the room. The breakthrough came from Samuel. Mustering his courage, the boy walked over and set a small, crudely carved wooden horse on the floor just beyond the man's reach. It was a toy his father had made for him. For a long time, the warrior just stared at it. Then, with great effort, he reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. A flicker of something sadness memory crossed his face. He looked at Alex, then at Samuel. His voice was rough from disuse. "Chaitin," he said, tapping his own chest. "Falcon." It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a bridge. A week later, the sound of hoofbeats sent a jolt of panic through Alex. She quickly threw a blanket over the sleeping Chaitin and motioned for Samuel to be quiet. Peeking out the window, her heart sank. It was Clay Rock, Silas Kane's foreman, accompanied by another of Kane's men. Rock was a tall, swaggering man with a cruel twist to his lips and pale, dead eyes. He dismounted and strode onto her porch as if he owned it. "Afternoon, Widow Finch," he said, his voice a lazy drawl that grated on her nerves. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mockery, not respect. "Mr. Kane was just wondering if you've reconsidered his generous offer for this dusty patch of land." "The land's not for sale, Mr. Rock," Alex said, keeping her voice steady, the shotgun held loosely at her side. Rock's eyes swept over her property, lingering on the creek. "Water's getting scarce. A creek like this, it's a valuable thing. Too valuable for a woman and a boy to protect." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he sniffed the air. "Smells different in here. You cooking something new?" Alex's blood ran cold. She could smell the faint, herby scent of the poultice she used on Chaitin's leg. "Just some rabbit stew," she lied, her hand tightening on the gun. Rock smirked, unconvinced. His gaze turned sharp, predatory. "You hear about that bank robbery over in Redemption? Real nasty business. Left Deputy Miller dead." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Word is the gang had an Indian with them. A Lakota murderer. They got into a squabble over the loot, shot him up, but he got away." He stared hard at her, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Sheriff's put a bounty on him. $50 dead or alive. Mr. Kane is offering a bonus to anyone who can deliver him." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a tightening noose. Rock wasn't just here about water rights. He was fishing, turning her homestead upside down with nothing more than his words. He was presenting her with an impossible choice. "You see any wounded strays, you let the sheriff know," Rock finished, his eyes boring into hers. "It'd be a real shame if someone thought you were helping a wanted killer. A real shame for you and the boy." He and his man finally rode off, but the threat lingered like poison in the air. When they were gone, Alex leaned against the door, her legs weak. She looked over at Chaitin. He was awake, the blanket pushed aside. He had heard everything. His dark eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a new understanding. They were no longer just a woman and a wounded man. He was a wanted murderer, and she was an accomplice. They were allies, bound together, by a shared and deadly secret. The fragile peace inside her cabin had shattered. The world outside was not just circling anymore. It was closing in for the kill. The alliance between Alex and Chayton was born of necessity and sealed in silence. With Rock's accusation hanging between them, the nature of Chayton's presence had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a patient. He was a liability, a secret that could cost Alex and Samuel everything. Yet the words he had muttered in his delirium, "Silver spur, stolen papers," echoed in her mind, a counterpoint to Rock's convenient story. As Chayton's strength returned, so did his awareness. He was a prisoner in the cabin, a cage made of healing flesh and her four walls. Communication became their primary challenge and their greatest hope. With a piece of charcoal and the smooth, flat stones from the hearth, they began to speak a new language. One evening, Alex drew a simple picture of the bank in Redemption. She drew masked men guns and a fallen deputy. She looked at him, her expression a question. "Were you there?" Chayton took the charcoal, his hand surprisingly steady. He nodded slowly. Then he began to draw. His images were stark and elegant. He drew the bank, but he drew himself outside, hidden, watching. He drew the four robbers, and on the heel of one, he etched a detailed coiled snake, the silver spur. A cold knot formed in Alex's stomach. He had seen him too. Then Chayton's drawing took a turn she didn't expect. He drew a circle of teepees, his village. He drew an old man, a chief, carefully rolling a parchment map and placing it in a leather satchel. He then drew the satchel being given to Mr. Hemlock, the bank manager, who placed it inside a lockbox, identical to the one Alex had seen the robbers carry away. He pointed to the drawing of the map, then tapped his chest. His people. Theirs. It was a treaty map, he explained with gestures, and a few broken English words he was beginning to learn. A sacred document that proved his people's claim to the land north of the Black Hills, a claim Silas Kane was actively disputing. The bank was supposed to be the safest place for it. His next drawing was of the robbery itself. He depicted himself tracking the gang not as a member, but as a guardian of the map. When they fled the bank, he had followed. He drew a confrontation in a rocky canyon miles from town. He drew himself fighting the man with the silver spur, the knife gash on his arm, a testament to the struggle. He had been shot in the chaos, left for dead, as they rode off with both the map and the lockbox containing Thomas's papers. The stolen papers he had spoken of were not his. He was an accidental witness to a much larger crime. The pieces began to click into place with horrifying clarity. Rock's story was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative, to turn the town against anyone who might have seen the truth. Kane hadn't sent his men to rob a bank for money. He was a wealthy man. He had sent them to retrieve two pieces of evidence, at once the Lakota treaty map that challenged his land grab and whatever Thomas had hidden in his own lockbox. Alex remembered Thomas shortly before his death, poring over his old surveying maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had been muttering about Kane's land claims about lines that didn't add up. He's claiming half the valley, Thomas had told her, but his deeds are based on landmarks that move with every flood season. It's fraud, Alex. Plain as day. The rising action became a tense cat-and-mouse game. Alex knew she needed more information, proof that would stand against the word of a man as powerful as Silas Kane. Leaving Chayton hidden in a small concealed cave in the hills north of the creek, she made another trip to Redemption, this time not for supplies, but for answers. The town was a hostile territory. The whispers that had followed her before were now angry murmurs. Clay Rock's story had taken root. In the saloon which she forced herself to enter on the pretense of looking for a hired hand, she overheard men talking. They spoke of the savage the widow was hiding, calling for a posse to cleanse the territory. Her blood ran cold, but she kept her face placid, gathering her courage. Her true destination was the office of Sheriff Brody. She found him slumped behind his desk, a bottle of cheap whiskey at his elbow. He looked weary, a man drowning in a job he was too compromised to perform. "Sheriff," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "About the bank robbery. The men who did it. They weren't after money. They took a specific lockbox. Brody wouldn't meet her eye. It was a robbery, Mrs. Finch. Desperate men do desperate things. And the Indian they're blaming," she pressed. "What proof do you have that he was involved?" Clay Rock's men identified him. Brody mumbled, his voice thick with resignation. "That's good enough for most folks around here. It's not good enough for me." Alex said, her voice rising. "My husband Thomas had a box in that bank. I believe what they were after is connected to him. He had a dispute with one of Silas Kane's men right before he died." At the mention of Kane, a flicker of fear crossed the sheriff's face. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. "You need to go home, Mrs. Finch. You are stirring a pot you don't have a spoon for. Go home, mind your own business, and forget you ever came here. Some things are better left buried." His fear was more damning than any confession. Brody knew more than he was saying. He was trapped, a pawn in Kane's game. Alex left his office with a heavy heart, but with a new resolve. There would be no help from the law. If she wanted justice, she would have to find it herself. All the while, Rock's men were a constant presence, circling her property like vultures. They never came close enough for a confrontation, but their message was clear: we are watching. We are waiting. Back in the quiet solitude of the cabin, the weight of her discoveries pressed down on her. The danger was no longer a vague threat. It had a face, a name, and a silver spur. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself tidying Thomas's old things, a ritual of grief that had become less frequent over the months. She ran her hand over his worn leather tool belt, the scent of sawdust and oil, a faint ghostly reminder of him. As she moved his heavy toolbox, she felt a slight shift, a loose board at the bottom, her fingers trembling with a sudden premonition, pried at the wood. It came away, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound journal. With shaking hands, Alex lit a lantern and opened the book. The first few pages were filled with Thomas's familiar neat script, detailing crop rotations and plans for a new barn. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew darker, more urgent. She began to read, and the world she thought she knew fell away, revealing a chasm of deceit and murder beneath her feet. The journal confirmed her deepest fears. Silas Kane hadn't just been a rival rancher. Years ago, in a different territory, he and Thomas had been business partners. They had a shared venture, buying up land for new settlements. But Thomas soon discovered Kane's method, using fraudulent claims, forged documents, and intimidation to cheat poor settlers and local tribes out of their land, then reselling it at an immense profit. He calls it business. One entry read, "I call it theft. He preys on the hopeful and the helpless. I cannot be a part of this. I have told him I am finished." Thomas had spent the next years secretly compiling proof of Kane's scheme, the original deeds, sworn affidavits from cheated families, his own surveyor's notes exposing the fraudulent boundaries. These were the documents he had placed in the safe deposit box, for safekeeping, intending to take them to a federal marshal. The final entry was dated the day he had last returned from redemption, the night he had told her about the man with the silver spurs. "Had a final confrontation with Kane's man today. He knows what I have. The threats were no longer veiled. He told me some secrets are worth killing to keep buried. I fear for my family. I must get the evidence to Fort Laramie as soon as possible. The entry below it, written a few days later, was in a shaky, spidery script, barely legible. A terrible cough has taken hold. My lungs burn. The water from the well tastes strange. Alex thinks it's the changing seasons. That was the last thing he ever wrote. Alex stared at the page, the words blurring through her tears. A single chilling certainty washed over her, cold and absolute. Her husband didn't die of lung fever. He was poisoned. The strange taste in the water. The swift, violent illness that had baffled the doctor. It was murder. Cold, calculated, and cruel. Silas Kane didn't just want her land for the water. He wanted it because he believed Thomas's evidence was still hidden there somewhere. He wanted to bulldoze the last living link to his criminal past, to silence the widow of the man he had murdered. The fight was no longer for a patch of dirt and a creek. It was for justice. It was for Thomas. A new hard resolve settled in her heart, displacing the fear. She looked out the window into the darkness, toward the vast dark lands owned by Silas Kane. He had started a war a year ago when he poisoned her husband. Now he was about to learn that the widow Finch was ready to finish it. The discovery of Thomas's journal changed everything. The grief that had settled into a dull ache in Alex's heart now burned with the sharp, clean fire of righteous anger. Every threat from Kane, every menacing visit from Rock was no longer just an act of greed, but another desecration of Thomas's memory. She and Chayton were no longer merely fugitives hiding from a corrupt system. They were soldiers in a war for justice. When she showed Chayton the journal, he understood immediately. He pointed to Kane's name and then to the drawing he had made of the snake spur, his eyes dark with recognition. The man who had murdered her husband was the same man who had stolen his people's future. Their separate fights were one and the same. Silas Kane, however, was growing impatient. The whispers and rumors he had seeded in town were not enough to drive the widow from her land. His subtle campaign of intimidation had failed. Now fueled by the humiliation of his men at the creek, he escalated his attack from psychological warfare to a brutal physical assault. The first sign was the creek itself. The steady, life-giving flow of water that was the heart of the homestead slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Alex and Chayton followed the dry creek bed upstream and found the source. A mile from her property on Kane's land, his men had constructed a crude but effective dam of rock and timber, diverting the entire flow of Whispering Creek into a reservoir for his own vast herds. He was strangling her land, cutting off its very lifeblood. The effect was immediate and devastating. The small garden Thomas had so carefully cultivated began to wither under the relentless sun. The earth cracked and turned to dust. Her small herd of cattle, their ribs already beginning to show, stood listlessly by the empty creek bed, their lowing calls a constant mournful complaint. The true terror began when Samuel fell ill. He woke one morning with a flushed face and a dry, rasping cough. Dehydration. The water from their well was still usable, but it was hard water heavy with minerals, and their supply was finite. It was not enough to sustain them, their livestock, and their crops. Kane's move was a slow, cruel checkmate. He didn't need to send men with guns. He could let the sun and the thirst do his work for him. Desperation drove Alex and Chayton to action. They were forced to abandon their defensive posture. They had to reclaim their water. Using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, Chayton devised a plan. It was risky, a direct strike against the source of Kane's power. They would not destroy the dam, an act that would bring the full force of Cain's men down on them. They would sabotage it, creating a weakness that would fail under pressure at a time of their choosing. Under the cover of a moonless night, they made their way to the dam. The journey was agonizing for Chaitin. His leg, though healed, was a source of constant grinding pain, the limp more pronounced with every step on the uneven ground. Yet he moved with a grim, silent determination. They found 2 of Cain's men, guarding the structure, their lazy conversation, and the glow of their cigarettes drifting on the night air. This was not a fight Chaitin could win with force. He relied on cunning. He and Alex spent an hour gathering dried tumbleweeds and prairie grass, piling them into a massive heap upwind from the guard's position. With a single spark from Alex's flint and steel, the heap ignited not into a raging fire, but into a cloud of thick, acrid smoke that the wind carried directly toward the dam. The guards, cursing and coughing, left their posts to investigate the source of the smoke, believing it to be a small brush fire. In that window of opportunity, Alex and Chaitin scrambled down to the base of the dam. Working frantically with a crowbar from Thomas's toolbox, they loosened the foundational rocks, wedging smaller stones into the gaps to hide their work. They weakened the structure at its most critical point, turning Cain's monument of power into a time bomb. They slipped away into the darkness moments before the guards returned, satisfied that the fire had been nothing more than a smoldering bush. Back at the homestead, the waiting began. Samuel's condition worsened, his small body listless with fever. Alex sat by his bedside, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, her heart constricting with a terrible fear. This was Cain's true cruelty. He wasn't just attacking her land, he was attacking her son. The sky remained stubbornly clear for 2 days. Then on the 3rd afternoon, the world changed. The horizon turned a sickly, bruised purple. The air grew still and heavy, the prelude to a storm of immense power. The first drops of rain fell fat and heavy, kicking up puffs of dust. Within minutes, the drizzle became a torrential downpour. Alex and Chaitin watched from the cabin door as the parched land drank greedily. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Miles away, the rain would be filling the reservoir behind the weakened dam. The pressure would be building. As if summoned by the storm, a posse appeared on the horizon. Clay Rock was at its head, a reluctant Sheriff Brody beside him, and a dozen of Cain's men and deputized townsfolk behind them. They had come to deliver the final blow, to evict the stubborn widow under the cover of the storm. But as they drew closer, a low, distant roar began to build a sound like the world tearing apart. The dam had broken. A wall of water, a churning, muddy torrent came surging down the dry bed of Whispering Creek. It wasn't a flood. It was a detonation. It ripped through the prairie, carrying timber and rock with it, a physical manifestation of their rebellion. Rock and his men reined in their horses, their faces a mixture of shock and awe, as the flash flood thundered past, restoring life to the creek in a single, violent act of reclamation. The water was their victory. But as the posse turned their stunned gazes from the raging creek to the small cabin, their expressions hardened. The fight was far from over, and now the heavens themselves had joined the battle. The rain turned into a punishing sheet, and the wind began to howl, kicking up the dry topsoil. A monstrous swirling brown cloud was growing on the plains, a dust storm. The final confrontation had arrived. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of brown grit and howling wind. The dust storm descended upon the homestead not as weather, but as a living entity, a suffocating blanket that erased the landscape and turned midday into a twilight hell. Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind shrieked a physical force that tore at clothes and stung the eyes. Sounds were distorted, carried away one moment, and amplified the next, creating a battlefield of auditory illusions. Inside the cabin, Alex held a sleeping Samuel, who had finally found relief in a fever-free slumber thanks to the fresh water. She had laid him in the root cellar, covering him with blankets. "No matter what you hear, you stay here," she had whispered, kissing his forehead. "Mama will come for you." Chaitan stood by the door, his face a mask of intense concentration. This storm was not a hindrance. It was his greatest ally. He was a creature of this land, and the storm was his camouflage. He looked at Alex, his dark eyes conveying a simple, powerful message. "Trust me. Fight smart." The posse, disorganized by the sudden fury of both the flood and the storm, advanced in a ragged line, their forms little more than ghostly silhouettes in the swirling dust. They were blind, disoriented, and angry. Alex took her position in the shallow trench Chaitan had dug behind a rocky outcrop. She could barely see the front of her own cabin. She would have to rely on her ears and her instincts. Chaitan, meanwhile, melted into the chaos. He was no longer a man with a crippled leg. He was a spirit of the storm, using the howling wind to cover his movements. The first two of Kain's men who blundered toward the cabin were dispatched without a gunshot. A rope stretched taut between two fence posts and invisible in the dust sent their horses tumbling. The men went down hard, their curses swallowed by the gale. They were out of the fight. From her trench, Alex heard the crunch of boots nearby. A figure emerged from the brown haze rifle raised. It was one of the townsfolk, his face wide with fear. She raised her shotgun, the twin barrels a black maw in the gloom. "Go home," she screamed over the wind. "This isn't your fight." The man, startled, fired blindly, the shot going wide. Alex didn't return fire. She held her ground, a silent, unmovable defender. The man hesitated, then scrambled back into the storm, unwilling to die for Silas Kane's greed. Chaitan worked with methodical, brutal efficiency. He used his spear crutch not as a weapon to kill, but as a tool to disable. He appeared from the dust like an apparition, striking a man's knee, shattering a rifle stock, tripping another into a muddy ditch. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, his strange, limping gait, a rhythmic, terrifying beat in the symphony of chaos. The posse, already on edge, began to panic. They were fighting phantoms. Men shouted warnings that were snatched away by the wind, firing at shadows that turned out to be nothing more than tumbleweeds. Clay Rock, enraged and blinded by dust and fury, charged forward. "She's in the rocks," he bellowed. "Get her." He was 100 yards away when Sheriff Brody finally made his choice. He spurred his horse not toward the rocks, but directly into Rock's path. "It's over," Clay Brody yelled. "We're leaving." "Get out of my way, you coward," Rock snarled, raising his pistol. But the storm had one more participant. Silas Kane, himself unable to watch from a distance any longer, had ridden into the fray, determined to oversee the destruction of the last obstacle to his legacy. He appeared through the swirling dust, his fine coat and hat already caked in mud, his face a mask of cold fury. It was in that moment that a dying man's confession found its voice. One of the men Chaitan had disabled earlier, a ranch hand named Peters with a shattered collarbone, was being tended to by Brody. Seeing Kane, the man's eyes filled with a feverish terror. It was him Sheriff Peters rasped, coughing up blood. "A year ago. Kane paid me to poison the Finch's well, just a little at a time. So it'd look like sickness." Brody stared from the dying man to the cattle baron, the full monstrous truth finally crashing down on him. Cain saw the look on Brody's face and knew he was exposed. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a polished revolver, his target no longer the cabin, but the sheriff. "Some secrets die hard," Cain hissed. He never fired the shot. Chayton exploded from the gloom, his charge not fast but utterly unstoppable. He slammed his spear crutch against the leg of Cain's horse. The animal screamed and went down, sending Cain sprawling into the mud. Chayton stood over him, spear raised. But from the rocks, Alex emerged, shotgun in hand. Her face was streaked with grime, her eyes burning with a cold, clear light. This was her fight. This was her justice. She strode past Chayton and stood over the man who had murdered her husband and tried to destroy her son. Cain looked up at her from the mud, his arrogance finally stripped away, revealing the pathetic, frightened man beneath. Thomas was a good man, Alex said, her voice clear and steady above the storm. She leveled the shotgun at Cain's chest. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. She had the power to execute him, to exact the revenge she so richly deserved. She saw Thomas's face, heard his laughter, felt the searing pain of his loss. Then she saw Samuel's face. She would not make her son the child of a killer. Justice was not the same as revenge. With a final resolute cry, she swung the shotgun not as a firearm, but as a club. The heavy stock connected with Cain's temple. He collapsed unconscious, his face half buried in the mud he had tried to claim as his own. The victory was hers. It was not a victory of bullets or bloodshed, but of courage, cunning, and the unbreakable strength of a woman who had chosen justice over hatred. As the dust storm slowly began to subside, a profound silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the sound of the wind and the steady, life-giving rush of the reclaimed creek. Just as the last of the posse surrendered to a redeemed Sheriff Brody, a new sound rolled across the plains, the thunder of dozens of galloping horses. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared. It was a Lakota war party, their faces painted, their lances held high. At their head was a stern, powerful warrior named Sitting Bear. They had been drawn by a signal Chayton had made days before, a small, deliberate pile of stones on the highest hill, a prayer to his people. They had come for a battle, but the battle was already over. They reined in their horses, their eyes taking in the scene with stunned disbelief of the routed posse, the captured cattle baron, the defiant widow with a shotgun. And in the center of it all, Chayton. They saw his crippled leg, and then they saw the tactical masterpiece of chaos he had wrought upon a force that outnumbered him 20-1. They had come to save a lost warrior. Instead, they found a brilliant commander. Sitting Bear dismounted and approached Chayton not with pity, but with a look of profound, awestruck respect. He saw a new kind of leader, one whose strength was not in his legs, but in his mind. Sheriff Brody, his authority restored, and his conscience cleared, took the dying Peter's confession. Armed with the truth, Thomas's journal, and Cain's own captured men as witnesses, he arrested Silas Cain and Clay Rock. He assured Alex that they would face a federal judge and that the full weight of the law would finally come down on the right side of justice. The Lakota War Party bore witness to it, all their presence ensuring that this time the white man's law would not be so easily bent. Months later, peace had settled over Whispering Creek. The land, secure and flourishing, was a testament to Alex's resilience. The community in Redemption, knowing the full story of Cain's treachery, now treated her not with suspicion, but with a deep and abiding respect. She was no longer just the widow Finch. She was the woman who had stood her ground and won. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived, brought by a traveling priest. It was from Chayton. He wrote that he was now known among his people as Chayton Mapia, the Falcon of the Sky. He was not a war chief, but a strategist, helping the scattered bands of Lakota negotiate for their rights, using his mind as his primary weapon. He was turning his people's pain into purpose, just as he had turned his own. The final scene of the story unfolded on a quiet Sunday. Alex took Samuel to the small hill overlooking the freely flowing creek where Thomas was buried. The simple wooden cross was weathered but strong. She took Thomas's journal from her satchel and placed it on the gravestone. His fight was over. His name was cleared, his honor restored. As she and Samuel stood there, watching the clean waters sparkle in the sun, she felt not the familiar ache of grief, but a profound sense of peace. It was the strength of a future she had not inherited, but had forged for herself and her son in fire dust and water. When they returned to the cabin, a small object sat on the porch rail. It was a falcon exquisitely carved from a single piece of cottonwood, its wings outstretched, its eyes sharp and fierce. There was no note. None was needed. It was a silent acknowledgement from 1,000 miles away, a symbol of a bond that transcended worlds and words. Alex picked it up, its smooth, polished surface warm from the sun, and smiled.